There are at least 47 data centers in Wisconsin, and nearly half are in southeastern Wisconsin. Data centers are spaces housing information technology infrastructure that's used for building, running, and developing applications and services for companies like Amazon and Microsoft. They use a lot of energy and water, and that's concerning some who are opposed to data centers. Here to help us better understand that opposition is Brian Rogers. He is the Environmental Justice Director for Walnut Way Conservation Corps. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Denise.
What is it about Wisconsin that makes it attractive to companies that want to build and operate data centers? Is it our location, some of our infrastructure? What is it that makes it an attractive option?
It's a great question. I mean, there are some ways that Wisconsin intentionally set itself up to be a major attractor of data center development. And in other ways, like you mentioned, there are other geographic and resource conditions that make Wisconsin particularly hospitable, at least from the business perspective, for these massive hyperscale AI facilities. The geography is certainly one. Lake Michigan being, the part of the largest freshwater system on the planet. These are facilities that require massive amounts of water to cool the systems. There's also very amenable tax incentives that is in state legislature, or rather in state policy, that makes it very, very attractive for companies like Google, Meta, OpenAI.
When we take a look at the data centers that are here in southeastern Wisconsin, people may be familiar with two of them. There is one in Port Washington. That is an $8 billion center on approximately 700 acres. Microsoft is also building on 1,600 acres in Mount Pleasant and another 400 acres in Kenosha. These are going to be huge sites, and they're going to consume a lot of energy.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think it's important, before we talk about how we feel about these proposed developments that are, again, in various stages of development, is who was asking for this. In other words, was it communities asking for the kinds of massive investments that data center companies are making in these municipalities? And it depends, I suppose, who you ask. If you ask the people living there, pretty unanimously, across geography, across race, across political ideology, the response to that question is absolutely not. So we see organized communities resisting the imposition of these hyperscale developments. And in the process, I've learned a lot about the tactics that private corporations, multi-billion-dollar corporations, are using in order to strike the best deal in places like Racine, in Mount Pleasant, and in Port Washington, and others. And I think there's a case before the Public Service Commission right now, in fact, that is the utility, We Energies, proposal for what kind of conditions these data centers will need to operate under, particularly as it relates to the massive amounts of power these facilities will require to be operational. And so we know, in the case of the Mount Pleasant facility, last year in March, there was $2 billion of methane gas, fossil fuel infrastructure that was permitted, greenlit, for specifically this Microsoft data center. There's massive capital costs associated with that, and the utility gets their return on equity around 10%, no matter what. So who's going to actually subsidize the cost of this energy build out? Are average Wisconsin families and small businesses.
Well, let's talk about how that happens, because you would think, particularly when we're talking about these multinational companies worth trillions of dollars, that there would be the money there for them to build and operate these. But residential consumers, with the proposal that's before the Public Service Commission now, we're going to fit part of the bill.
Exactly. The way that the proposal is currently written and the way that it's currently being deliberated by the Public Service Commission, again, We Energies' proposal, which I think it's also important to state, there were about 3 years that we know of conversations, meetings between utility executives and the data center firms, Microsoft, Vantage, Meta. And so we know that after 3 years of negotiations, this is what those negotiations produced in terms of conditions for this very large customer, aka data centers, what this rate structure is going to look like. You ask either one of the utility or the data center companies, and they will tell you that 0% of costs are going to be shifted onto consumers. But when pressed and compelled to give evidence, where is the cost and service analysis that We Energies has conducted in order to prove that very important claim that costs will not be shifted onto residential ratepayers, they say we haven't done it yet and we'll do that in a later rate case. Anybody who's been living here knows our energy bills have been going up at a clip. In the past 12 years, We Energies has raised rates 7 times. They will go to the Public Service Commission again later this year and ask for even more money. And that is despite, to say nothing of this data center influx. And so the imposition of these massive resource guzzling, environmentally degrading and bill increasing facilities are again requiring the kinds of power that in the 120 years that We Energies has been providing power to southeastern Wisconsin, they've built about 2 gigawatts of power. And a gigawatt is like a city of Orlando, including its Disney World. Those 2 projects that you mentioned earlier, Denise, the Microsoft campus in Mount Pleasant and Port Washington Lighthouse facility in Port Washington, would double the capacity of the entire We Energies grid just across those 2 projects. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not between the 2 of them, over 1 million homes that they could power.
Wow.
But not a single home or business asked for this, asked for these investments and infrastructure to be
We
made.
do want to quickly talk about the environmental impact because, as you said, these facilities require lots of water. We have lots of water here because of our access to Lake Michigan. Are there environmental concerns about the amount of water that will be needed and how that potentially impacts the ecosystem of the place where we all get our drinking water?
One of my team members recently walked up to me with the Instagram post, and it is like 4 minutes of just a scrolling line of impacts that the data center will have. Some of them are financial, some of them are around jobs, some of them are economic, some of them are political. A lot of them are environmental. The disturbing and in some cases destruction of natural ecosystems. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of acres being effectively seized under NDA and trade secrecy agreements by some of the wealthiest corporations in the history of money in towns the size of, 10,000 people, promising that they were going to transform the economy, that they'll bring quote unquote progress. And yet we know that the amount of jobs that it produces are scant, that the economic prospects are very dismal, and the environment is a huge, huge, frankly, unifying concern because of the fossil fuel infrastructure that will need to be built out under the current proposal. We know that will generate enormous costs in terms of public health, in terms of loss of ecosystem, and the water consumption and air pollution that is going to result from the 24/7, 365 operation of these facilities. It is astounding to think that we can live in a state with a Democratic governor and democratically appointed public service commissioners and DNR officials who, knowing that southeastern Wisconsin is already in an EPA federally designated non-attainment zone, basically meaning the air is already bad here. They carved out a business exemption for that, specifically for these data centers. And we know that that is going to be the greatest accelerator of public health harms and climate,
Right.
increasing greenhouse gas emissions, and thereby exacerbating climate change.
Well, Ryan, we know that from what you've laid out, there are a lot of concerns. We know that there are a lot of community members who are speaking up, and we really appreciate you being here with us to talk about it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We're right back. Stay with us.